Hello and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Chris Munsier and I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's session. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition on the PSU campus since 2000. These seminars are usually held in person, but due to the pandemic, we're hosting them fully online. It's important to acknowledge that Portland State University's urban campus is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin Kailapua, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of their sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, to remember these communities and to honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, I'm very happy to have my colleagues at Portland State University, Dr. Jenny Liu and Dr. Jennifer Dill, present on the economic impacts of street improvements, findings from the Portland metro area. Jenny Liu is an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. She is an environmental and resource economist with a focus in transportation economics. Her research interests include the economics of alternative energy sources, links between transportation choices and environmental issues, the effects of physical infrastructure networks and social networks on the adoption of transportation technologies, and technology adoption and its effect on climate change, particularly within the urban and development context. Dr. Jennifer Dill is a professor in the Nohad A. Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University and director of the Transportation Research and Education Center, TREC, at Portland State. TREC houses the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, which she also directs. NITSE is a national university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation, focusing on improving mobility for people and goods to build stronger communities. Dr. Dill also serves on the Board of Trustees for the Transit Center, a New York-based foundation that works to improve public transportation in cities across the U.S. Before jumping into the seminar, I'd like to let you glance at the upcoming webinars for the remainder of the fall quarter. And just a quick overview of attending the Zoom webinar. We'll be recording the slides and they will be available. We'll be recording the presentation and the slides will be available after the event. The speakers will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes and there'll be a question and answer period. You can type your question and answers in the Q&A feature on the Zoom control panel, and we will moderate those questions and ask them of the speakers at the end. If you need the closed captioning feature or want to enable it, you need to click on it on the Zoom control panel. And if you are taking these for professional development hours, the seminar is available for eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So with that, I'm going to stop share and turn it over to our presenters.
Great. Thank you so much. We're very happy to be here. So my colleague, Professor Liu, is going to be managing the slides, and we're tag teaming this presentation because it was a collaborative project. But I'm going to get us started with an overview of the project. So the overall objective of this research project is to provide a quantitative and qualitative assessment of the benefits of active transportation infrastructure in the Portland, Oregon region, and the benefits particularly from an economic standpoint. The project was funded by Metro, our regional government here in Portland, with different tasks being done by Portland State University, staff at Metro, and Alta Planning and Design is working on taking all of our findings and producing a final report and other materials to share with the public. So this was a large sort of multitask project. Today, we are focusing on just one of those tasks, and I want to recognize two of our graduate research assistants who helped a lot with this research, Minji Cho and Kyu-Ri Kim. And also I want to recognize our collaborator on task 3, Dr. Marisa Zapata. So I mentioned that this is being, the project is funded by Metro. And part of the context is that the Portland Metro area has invested a lot of public funding in infrastructure to support their vision and their 2040 growth concept, which is to increase the amount of travel happening in this region on modes other than driving alone in a private vehicle. And part of that growth concept involves regional and town centers and main streets and developing areas with a higher density of activity that will then enable more transit, pedestrian, and bicycle travel. And so this active transportation infrastructure investments are part of that larger vision of where the region is going. So next slide. In terms of the project itself, there were 3 tasks. The first task, which is task 1, was led by Portland State University, Dr. Liu and myself. Task 2 is being done by staff at Metro. And task 3 was also done by Portland State. Those first 2 tasks are quantitative and technical in nature, and task 3 is a more qualitative analysis. The difference between task 1 and task 2 has to do partly with what types of infrastructure were we examining. So task 1 are what are called catalyst projects. So these were investments that were made in those regional or town centers or along main streets throughout the region. And they focus primarily on pedestrian improvements that would support the development, the mixed use development happening in those areas. In this analysis on task 1, our focus was on the business activity that is expected to occur as part of these cumulative investments. And we'll get into the details of that. Task 3 or 2 is looking at what we call the longer gap filling bikeways that connect to destinations. So those are a lot of trails and other types of separated bikeways, other types of infrastructure that allow people to travel to destinations on bike and walking as well. The focus of that analysis is looking at the benefits to the users. And that can be in travel time savings, it can be in health benefits, and we can estimate sort of the economic benefits of those types of user benefits. And again, that is a task being done by Metro staff, and they are in the process of finishing that analysis right now. Task 3, which we also did at Portland State, again with our colleague, Dr. Zapata and some other graduate students, was looking at all of those projects, the catalyst projects and those longer gap filling bikeway projects from a more qualitative perspective. We know that what we learned from the quantitative analysis is limited by some of the data that we have, and that a qualitative approach can really help understand what's happening as a result of these investments and can be much more comprehensive in terms of the types of benefits that we look at. So in that part of the task, we went out, we did interviews. It was during COVID though, so we didn't actually physically go out and meet people in person, but we collected a lot of qualitative information from a wide range of users using lots of different techniques. And that data has all been collected. All of that, the output from all of these tasks is being put into a final report and other documents, and that's what Alta Planning and Design is helping out with. Today, we are focusing just on presenting results from that task 1. And we'll provide a link at the end. We do have a link to a report that just focuses on the task 1 findings. Okay, Next slide. So just to give you a picture before we jump too much further, what do we mean by catalyst projects? So these are primarily pedestrian enhancements, sometimes some bicycle infrastructure, but primarily pedestrian improvements in these town and regional centers and main streets. There's a few pictures there. So Southeast Division in the city of Portland. So things like safe crossings and landscaping, improving sidewalks, Main Street Tigard, and a project out in Baseline, on Baseline in Cornelius. And we'll show you more pictures as this goes on, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the type of investment that we're focusing on today. Next slide. And these projects are spread throughout the whole region. So we have projects that are in sort of the inner core of the city of Portland, in denser, more developed areas, all the way out to Forest Grove and Cornelius, in smaller towns, all within the urban growth boundary, more suburban environments. There were 12 projects overall, and these were all constructed between 2006 and 2016. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Liu to focus on the methods that we used.
All right, so in focusing on task one, which is this quantitative analysis of what happens to businesses that are kind of adjacent to these pedestrian and bike improvements, we had to think about the types of data that we use as well as the methods that we use. And this is kind of an extension from some previous work that I did in the city of Portland. So the data that we're using kind of is more, I guess we have more data sources than a typical study of this type. So the reason that we wanted to do this is because each of these data sets have their advantages and disadvantages, as well as different indicators that they are kind of tracking. So on here, you can see that we are tracking 3 different variables just to get a more complete picture about what is happening to businesses. So we are looking at wages, we're looking at employment, and also sales revenue. So we were trying to figure out what is the best way to characterize all of these business activities. We took a look at 3 different data sources to cover these 3 variables. So we have the Census Bureau's LEHD, which is the longitudinal employment and household data set, which lasts from 2002 to 2017. And that only has employment data and is a little bit less of detail in terms of geographic detail. And then we also were, we had access to the QCEW data, which is the quarterly census of employment and wages, which comes from the Office of Economic Analysis here in Oregon. It is data that is reported by all of the business establishments to the state to satisfy their unemployment insurance requirements. So this data is actually very detailed, but it is on a quarterly basis. So we had a lot of detail from 2003 until 2018, and this covers both employment and wages. And then finally, we have the NETS data set, which is a proprietary data set that covers 2002 to 2017, looking at employment and sales revenue. So the idea is that we're kind of focusing in on kind of the ground floor retail of businesses that are surrounding these active transportation investments. So we are looking at both the retail sector, which are our shops, whether it be clothing shops or grocery stores of that sort. And then we also have our food and accommodation sector, which tends to be our restaurants and bars that are fronting these areas. So taking all of these data indicators, we had to figure out also what are the methods that we're going to be using. So we used kind of 3 different methodologies. First of which is an aggregated trend analysis. So basically taking a look at the trend of what's happening in each of these corridors with regards to the 3 different indicators that we had across all of the data sources in both of these retail and food and accommodation sector. And then we had two other more econometric quasi-experimental methods, one of which is difference in difference analysis, and the other is the interrupted time series analysis. So the main difference between these two econometric analyses is that the difference in difference analysis is really trying to compare econometrically between the corridor where we have these active transportation investments to other control corridors that did not get the same type of treatment. And what that means is that for those corridors where we use this type of analysis, it was required to find a control corridor. And you'll see that in some of our examples, particularly the case studies that we did in more town center areas in smaller cities, there tends to be very few locations, or actually no locations, that have the same characteristics, because you generally have one main street in one particular city, and that's it. There's nothing really to compare to. So we weren't able to use difference in difference for all of our analyses. So we tried to use the interrupted time series, which involves kind of looking at the trends before the improvement versus after the improvement, to see whether there are any changes in the level or the growth of employment, sales, or wages. And again, there's a lot more detail in our report about all of these methods, but we wanted to share with you what we did, but more so on the side of the results. So we're going to jump over now to our findings and pass it over to Jennifer.
All right, thank you. So this table summarizes the findings for all 12 projects. And again, because we're using 3 different data sources and 3 different methods, part of the value of doing so is that we can sort of triangulate some results. The results are not always consistent using those different data sources and methods. As Dr. Liu pointed out, it's different data. So what we presented here tries to summarize the findings collectively from all those sources and methods for both the retail sector and the food sector. And the quick reading of this chart is the more blue and the darker the blue, the more positive the results that we found. So positive association with one or more of those indicators in terms of jobs, sales or wages, and then again, the 2 sectors. So you can see in most of the cases, in most of these projects, we were able to see some positive associations with one or more of those indicators. There's a few cases where we found some negative results and no positive results for one sector. That only happened in a couple places. And there are some other places where we basically found no significant results. And so what we're going to do now is go through just a handful of these projects to give you a sense of the analysis and what the findings show us. And then we have some ideas from the larger perspective in terms of why we may see positive results in some of these project areas and not positive in others. But I do want to emphasize the overall positive results that we found. So the first project that we are going to look at is actually the farthest west from here, where I am in Portland, and that's in the town of Forest Grove. So this was a project that involved a lot of pedestrian improvements in several blocks in the downtown Forest Grove area, and along some of the streets leading into and out of that downtown area. And so within that center core area, which is where we would expect to see more of the retail and food business establishments, you can see things like safe crossings, enhanced crosswalks with decorative features, signage, street furniture, and those types of improvements. And these were completed in 2010. So our findings in Forest Grove are.
So just before I jump into kind of talking about all of the results, just wanted to point out that for each of these corridors, there are pages and pages of graphs and pages of regression results that would not be really practical to share. So I encourage you to take a look at any of the details in our report, because there is a lot that is really impossible to show on screen. So I tried to pull out some of the more key graphs to illustrate the overall results that we're seeing, but you may not see all of them all at once just because there is so much information. So in Forest Grove, the improvements occurred in 2010. And as we said previously, this is kind of the town center area, and it covers pretty much kind of the center of this town. So overall, we saw pretty positive impacts on both the food, employment, and wages, as well as retail employment and wages. And you can see that illustrated in these aggregated trend analyses graphs that we have. And these are in particular using the QCEW data. And in this particular circumstance, we did not have a control corridor because there's not another street in Forest Grove that had similar characteristics. And so we kind of compared this particular corridor with comparators of the city or the town of Gladstone, as well as the town of Forest Grove, just to base our the growth of employment and food and accommodations and retail on what is happening overall in the economies there. So each of these graphs are kind of showing an indexed wage and employment index. So we kind of base these indices on the 3 years prior to the construction year, which are the gray shaded areas that you can see on here. And you can kind of see that during those years, kind of 2008, 2009, those are the years of the Great Recession. So we kind of see that we're kind of starting from a pretty low level in terms of wage and employment. But when we're comparing to our comparators, both of these indices grew pretty significantly compared to before. And it's the same pattern with when you're comparing with either comparator. So I think that this was one of the more significant results, that this really shows that, not only using this data set, but using some of the other data sets, we were able to see positive impacts overall from the pedestrian improvements. So our next one is Southeast Division.
Yeah, so those of you who are in the Portland area, I'm going to guess that you are familiar with Southeast Division in the city of Portland. And those of you who have visited Portland and are maybe foodies, perhaps you have visited as well. This is the street that houses a lot of restaurants like Pok Pok and others that attract a lot of people. So this particular project was done in 2014. And it covered nearly 2 miles of Southeast Division, so the main stretch from around 7th to 39th, or what used to be called 39th, now Cesar Chavez. It included a lot of pedestrian improvements. You can see examples here, crossings in particular, improved sidewalks, these curb extensions, many of them incorporated Green Street features, so bioswales and landscaping. And these were done. There was also some public art along the corridor, some bike corrals for bike parking, and some street lighting improvements. And those of you who are very familiar with this corridor will also know that there are continued improvements that are happening right now as part of a transit improvement project. But these were the improvements that were done in the year 2014 that we are looking at.
So in terms of results from here, it's kind of unsurprising for those of you who frequent this particular stretch of road, is that there were very positive impacts in terms of the food sector using the trend and interrupted time series analysis. but not very clear impacts on retail and employment. So the two graphs that I'm showing here are, one is retail, one is food and accommodations. And you can see that even though prior to the improvements, there were some ups and downs, more fluctuation in employment in both of these sectors. After the improvements occurred, particularly in the food industry, there was very, very striking growth in food employment in this particular sector. So this is also another one of those streets where we could not find an appropriate control corridor just because this particular street was so unique in its characteristics. So this one was compared to Southeast Portland in general, as well as Portland as a whole, and the results were very positive in the food sector. So these are kind of more clear impacts, but we're going to start to show you a couple of other corridors that are kind of, we see some more surprising results.
So one of those is Southeast Foster and Woodstock in Portland, and this is an area also known as the Lentz Town Center. And so the project itself included striped bike lanes and pedestrian improvements along both of these streets, improving the sidewalks, improving landscaping, in addition to safer crossings. And the context of this project, I think, is important when we are discussing the results. There is a map in the corner there, and the area highlighted in yellow is our study area. You can see the two streets, and you can see that this area extends through a freeway, I-205, and you can see it in that photo, the largest photo there in the middle. And that's also where the light rail station is in that area. So this is a very busy traffic area. So they're both Foster and Woodstock are major arterial streets leading to and from the freeway. And it is also now a town center. And so these improvements enhance the pedestrian and bicycle access within and to and from this center. So the results.
What we found in Foster and Woodstock was that there was pretty clear negative impacts on food, employment, and wages using all three data sources and two of the analysis methods. And looking at the graphs that we have on here, so you'll see lots and lots of lines on here. The red line is the one that is our improved corridor, Foster Woodstock, and its control corridor is a segment of Powell Street that was Powell Boulevard that was identified here. And it's pretty clear that there are lots of fluctuations even after we were using indexed data along these streets. And you can see that particularly if you looked at the bottom right-hand graph here, which is the food and accommodations employment index using the QCEW data, is that following the construction, we see a pretty big drop off in terms of food employment right there with the red line. And looking at retail with the NETS data set up here on the upper left-hand graph, you can also see that both the control corridor and the improved corridor both experienced kind of a pretty big down drop in terms of retail employment. So, so we were kind of a little bit perplexed by all of the mixed signals that we were getting, or mixed results that were coming out of both the retail and the food data, as well as all of the data sources. And we were able to examine some of these in a little bit more detail, looking at the specific establishments that were kind of on these streets to see what is going on. And we were able to do that using both the QCEW data and the NETS data, both of which are kind of establishment level data. So we can actually see what are the stores that were open or closed. And I think one of the pretty significant things along the this corridor was that there were actually not a lot of establishments. There were about maybe 21 retail establishments, about 6 food and accommodation establishments in year 2010. So the idea that, you know, some of these dropped pretty significantly with lots and lots of jobs lost may be kind of due to the outsized effects on individual stores closing that were kind of maybe unrelated to the improvements at hand. So I think that in addition to these, there were a lot of kind of examination of what is going on in terms of the actual streets. There was also a lot of other changes in land use with regards to, there was a mixed use development of the Oliver Station that was being under construction. So that may have affected some of the businesses' decision to relocate or to close down. And also these are relatively, this is a relatively large street corridor with very much faster traffic, much higher volume of traffic compared to some of our other corridors that were analyzed. So I think that we'll talk a little bit more about kind of our overall, what we think that this, you know, how to interpret this, but I think that because of all of these kind of confounding factors along this corridor, our results were not quite clear about whether these pedestrian improvements really did contribute to positive impacts in the business community. And
so then the next project that we're going to highlight here is in the city of Gresham. And this is along Northeast Hood Avenue, which is in part of the downtown Gresham. This project connects with a light rail station and focuses again on pedestrian improvements, sidewalks, planter strips, some trees and street lights, curb extensions, crosswalks, improved ADA access, and you can see some of the landscaping and also sort of artwork and lighting improvements that happened in the area. It also connects to a park in the Gresham area where the farmers market occurs during parts of the year. There's an arts plaza, it's sort of a festival street, so it makes that connection. And these improvements were concluded in the year 2013.
So this one we chose to highlight because this was one where we did see pretty positive results in both the retail sector and the food sector, but those results were not fully consistent through all of the data sources. So I wanted to highlight that because I put on the slide here the 3 different employment indices using the 3 different data sets for retail. And you can see that if we were just looking at the LEHD data set, it would kind of show that retail was pretty much just kind of growing on par with the rest of the city of Gresham, whereas the QCEW data showed a significant growth and the NETS data set showed kind of an on-par growth with a kind of a big drop as we head towards the end of the data set. And this kind of highlights the differences of all of these data sources. So first of all, the LEHD data set has geographic detail pretty much only down to the census block, which means that it covers maybe some of the blocks that were not directly adjacent, some of the establishments that are not directly adjacent to the improvements that we're talking about potentially. And there is also some data fuzzing going on with the LEHD data set that we're not able to take a look to see exactly what is going on. What are the stores that are closing down or any of that detail? Whereas with the QCEW and the NETS data set, we were able to do that. But again, these 2 data sources are showing us very, very different things that are happening. And I think that one of the things that happens in the NETS data set is because some of these data sets treat some of the chain stores slightly differently than others. Sometimes it is coded to be located on these corridors, but sometimes they are coded to be located where the headquarters are. So there may be slight differences in what is included in the data sets. So on this corridor, the QCW data set actually only included about 5 to 10 establishments, whereas the NETS data set included 15 to 20 establishments in the retail sector. So a lot of the differences are possibly attributed to the differences in the data sources. So this really highlights the need to kind of look at all of these separate data sources as a whole to figure out what's going on, but also highlights, in addition to the quantitative analysis, the need to also conduct the qualitative analysis to really get on the ground and figure out what is going on with the businesses that are there. Yeah, so let's see.
So the final projects that we're going to sort of do a deeper dive on, we're both on Laughlin Boulevard, a stretch in Oregon City and a stretch in Milwaukie. And again, particularly for those in the audience who do not live in Portland or have not lived in Portland very long, Laughlin Boulevard is a major arterial that in most cases is 4 lanes wide. Parts of it are state highway controlled by Oregon DOT. It is a high-speed major, relatively high-speed major thoroughfare. It runs along the Willamette River, and in both Oregon City and Milwaukie, the town centers, the core, the downtowns of those 2 cities are right adjacent to Laughlin Boulevard. And so these 2 projects are the Oregon City one was almost a mile in length, at least the phase of the project that we looked at, and the Milwaukie project was almost half a mile long. And the improvements were largely pedestrian improvements and particularly crossing improvements. So if you can imagine, on one side of Laughlin, you have the river, and you also have great access to the river along using either the Willamette River Greenway Trail or in Milwaukie, the trolley trail. And there's also Milwaukie Bay Park there. So you have lovely access to the river and these great trails that are quite popular to use along the river. And then you have Laughlin Boulevard. So these improvements are, hopefully providing improved access to go from the river area to these downtown core town centers in both Laughlin, both Oregon City and Milwaukie. And so you can see the types of improvements there, primarily crossing, safer crossings to get between these destinations.
So these 2 segments of Laughlin Boulevard were a little bit tricky to analyze, particularly because the year of when the improvements were implemented. So in Oregon City, this was implemented in 2009, whereas in Milwaukie, it was implemented in 2006. So why it's tricky is because this is right around the years where there was the Great Recession going on, and also coupled with the fact that our data sets really didn't start too much before 2006 in the case of Laughlin in Milwaukie. So this left us with very little information to go on as to what were kind of the baseline conditions. But even with that in mind, we did find that in Laughlin in Oregon City that there were mostly positive impacts on retail employment and wages using pretty much all of our methodologies as well as all data sources. But on the food side of things, it did look like there were some mixed results depending on what data source you were using, as well as what analysis method was being implemented. So one of the key things that was happening along this corridor is that there, as Dr. Dill mentioned, these corridors kind of are have the river on one side. So you have nature on one side, but and business establishments on the other side, which meant that we didn't really we had maybe half the amount or even less of establishments that we were able to examine for these examples. So that did contribute to kind of the kind of mixed results, I think, that we were finding in these areas. So if we looked at Milwaukie, Laughlin Boulevard, we were seeing some positive impacts on food, employment, and wages, especially when we're comparing to its control corridor, which we compared to two different places. So one is the Laughlin Boulevard in Gladstone that did not receive the treatment. And we also compared to Laughlin Boulevard in Oregon City, which was kind of the subject of improvement in 2009. So we looked at that area kind of in the years prior to those improvements happened. So it looked like it was kind of positive compared to one corridor, but negative compared to the other corridor. And I think that in these two cases, there were improvements made, but the scope of the improvements is definitely not as extensive as some of the other ones that we just presented today. And I think one of the essential items that to note here is that these are also improvements that are done on a roadway that is a 4-lane arterial as well. So I think a lot of the mixed results started to show up in those particular circumstances. So in terms of conclusions, I think that what we highlighted is really kind of that using multiple data sources as well as a multiple methods approach really is the way to go, because a lot of times using just one data source, it really limits our ability to kind of interpret what exactly is going on any individual street. So with the multiple methods, we are able to overcome the fact that in some circumstances, we are unable to find an appropriate control corridor, or we have streets that are maybe need to be compared to multiple areas as well. And in terms of what we can conclude is basically that in terms of business impacts, we saw mostly positive results in terms of our retail and food and accommodation sectors, but really this was really limited to looking at those types of establishments. And there may be additional impacts to other businesses that are not ground level retail, that may be, say the second floor businesses that are providing professional services, or other types of work employment locations that are affected by these types of improvements, but we're not really able to see that with our analysis. There was, we did work on kind of trying to examine the employment that were the race and ethnicity of the people who were employed in these corridor locations, and to really try to figure out whether or not there is some association between the people who are employed in these areas after the improvements. And unfortunately, what we found was that we didn't find a lot of significant changes using the LEHT data to show us over the past 8 years in the 12 projects. Mostly there was not significant results. There were a couple of town centers, I think in Forest Grove and Gresham, as well as Beaverton town centers, where there were some more significant changes in the number of jobs for non-white and Hispanic groups. But none of it was really significant enough to garner any additional attention. I think it's really one of the downfalls of using the LEHT data set is that there really isn't enough detail for us to examine this particular question. And the other takeaway is that in some of the areas where we saw particularly significant positive results, or the areas that were kind of more the ones that had more positive, significant results, I think we kind of started noticing the real impact of complementary or cumulative impacts of other types of planning or investment activities. And by this, we mean the additional types of work that was being done in terms of building like transit-oriented developments or other economic development and investments that were being put into the area that were complementary. And I think that a lot of the cumulative effects are the ones that we are picking up in terms of the positive, significant impacts that we can see.
So just a few more conclusions, and this first one relates a lot to what Dr. Liu just mentioned. And so we do think that in a lot of these cases, particularly some of these town centers, it may take more time to see some of this growth in the local economy. And in particular, so for the four that we have highlighted here are Milwaukie, where the improvements were in 2016, Beaverton, where the improvement was in 2015, Tigard 2014, and Cornelius 2016. So we didn't have a whole lot of years of data after the improvements to look at. I would also perhaps put in the Foster Woodstock, the Lentz Town Center here as well. And so in many of these places are undergoing much more significant transformation than just the pedestrian and bicycle improvements that we were looking at. Those of you who are familiar, for example, with Lentz Town Center know that if physically the buildings are much different today than they were 10 years ago, for example. The same thing in Milwaukie, there's a new light rail station. There's a lots of brand new development. So it's not a matter of businesses just opening up in existing buildings. Some of these areas are being completely redeveloped, and so therefore a longer study time period is probably going to be useful. And then the second trend that we saw that has already been alluded to is that in some of these places, the improvements were along road corridors, Laughlin Boulevard, Foster, Woodstock, the improvements out in Cornelius, along road corridors that have pretty high traffic volume and higher speeds, more like 35 miles an hour instead of 20 or 25 miles an hour, which is what you would find, for example, on Southeast Division. And so we do think that sort of that environment, and this was revealed quite a bit in some of the qualitative data that we collected, that in those environments, that is sort of a challenge to perhaps providing this pedestrian focused commercial Main Street type environment. That is not to say, though, that we shouldn't be doing these types of improvements on these streets, because there are many benefits to these improvements. And, you know, in some cases we saw some increases in retail and or food business activity. There are clearly significant safety benefits from having these improved crossings. I think the examples of Laughlin Boulevard, these are making connections between the trails and the river to these town centers, where now there is, particularly in Milwaukie, significant residential growth in that town center. But there are some limitations to the improvements in these areas. And with that, we are concluding. We have some links there, and in particular, we'll put the link in the chat to the TREC website, where we have a very lengthy, detailed technical report covering this task one that is available there. We will also put in the chat some links to the previous work that Dr. Liu did, sort of a similar study on a national level that has, there's a guidebook about how to do this type of analysis.
All right, thank you for the excellent, engaging presentation. While you're typing your questions into the Q&A box, I want to make a quick announcement for PSU students. If you are interested in a leadership role in the Students in Transportation, Engineering, and Planning, which is our multidisciplinary student group, I've chatted the link there to the nomination form where you can sort of self-nominate yourself to participate. So in a few minutes, I'll chat the link to the email Google group that you can also join. So I think the first question I'm going to ask is a question asked by a student in the class about were there any gentrification indicating metrics considered? And if these were considered but ultimately not pursued, what were the main factors in your decision? And they had a follow-up point about owning versus renting, things like that.
Yeah, I think this is a great question and a really important question. So a few things. Within the scope of this study, how we were able to address this issue, though not in too much depth, is looking at race and ethnicity of the employees in these corridors. And Dr. Liu mentioned that we saw maybe some indications of positive trends, but it wasn't strong enough to have a clear, solid conclusion. When we went into this project, one of the things that we thought about looking at was housing prices around these corridors, and doing some analysis to see if there is a relationship between the improvements and housing prices in the area. We wanted to try to do something like that. It's extremely challenging, and partly because our task in this project was to focus in on these particular active transportation investments. So the pedestrian improvements and the bicycle improvements. And at the same time, there was a lot going on in these areas. So a new light rail station, a new transit-oriented development that went in, a brand new trail along the river. And so between that and the fact that we'd be in order to do that analysis to figure out how the pedestrian improvements would have perhaps been correlated with changes in housing prices, either rents or sales, we also would have need to know those pedestrian improvements throughout the whole region, because you have to control for that. And those data, unfortunately, are not available. I guess my main point here also is that the fact that we weren't able to address this directly in our analysis doesn't mean that it's not important. And I don't know if Dr. Liu has more to add.
Yeah, I think that it is an important question to answer, to think more about whether there are gentrification effects, not only for residential, but also on the business side of things, whether the business owners are changing or the types of businesses are changing. But unfortunately, that really wasn't the kind of objective of this particular study. We were really trying to focus in on whether there was more business activity, although we, as Dr. Dill mentioned, we tried to examine some of the related effects, but unfortunately, it wasn't something that we could really focus on with the available data.
Great. And a question on your qualitative work. Did you do any interviews, focus groups with business owners?
We did. So as part of task 3, we did interviews. The other thing to note is this project, though it started just in late 2019, most of it was conducted during sort of the height of COVID restrictions. So we weren't able to do what we had wanted to do, which was just wander around these areas and walk in and talk to business owners. And so it was all done virtually, but we were able to interview some business owners in these areas. And that is part of our task 3. It quite honestly, though, was also a challenge, because in the middle of a pandemic, these business owners, particularly retail and food, talking to a PSU researcher is probably not on their high priority list when they're trying to figure out how to keep their business going. So we did the best we could. And we did get some good qualitative feedback. For example, in the Foster Woodstock, feedback from businesses about sort of the traffic and their business and things like that.
Okay, a question on, were there other factors such as changes in land use policies and regulations or economic incentives accounted for when measuring the specific impact of the pedestrian improvements? For example, rezonings along the corridor or establishments of business associations, excuse me, that might have contributed to the increase or decrease in wages and employment?
Not specifically, but all of these improvements were done in places that Metro has designated as a regional center, a town center, or a main street. And by definition, that means these are areas that have been zoned for mixed use, higher density, commercial style development. And so, you know, they're not zoned all identical because they're in different cities, but they all had the underlying zoning and planning tools in place that would allow and promote this style of development.
And I think that for the corridors where we were able to, we tried to control for just general economic conditions as well as things that could affect similar areas by finding appropriate control corridors or at least comparator areas that we're looking at. So I think that even though we didn't specifically put those things in the rezoning or other incentives or business associations in there as controls, I think that some of it can be accounted for using those methodological techniques. But yeah, those are great things to think about.
I do see a question since I will help out my colleague, Professor Von Seer, in terms of questions. I do see one, you know, are we planning on continuing the study in some of the locations? We don't have specific, you know, we were given funding by Metro to do this specific study, but we definitely recommend that for some of these areas, we have a longer time period. And the person asking the question particularly pointed to Foster Woodstock. And I completely agree. I spent some time out there for this project and I'm really interested to see where it goes. So we will probably look for opportunities to be able to do that since we do have all the data. We just need to add some more years of data. But we as the PSU researchers don't have a specific plan to do that yet, but it is something that we'll be continuing conversations with Metro about.
Yeah, and I think we only have 2 more minutes, so I'll answer one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A box here. So this question was asking about the Cornelius baseline result, where there was kind of more positive towards the food sector and some negative in the retail sector. And this particular corridor was as Dr. Dill mentioned a little bit later. So some of the results may not be as significant as some of the other corridors that we looked at. But in this particular case, I think that there was some indication that there was a shift from the retail sector towards more food establishments in that main street area of Cornelius. But I think that to really establish whether that is indeed what's going on, I think we need more years of data in that case.
And then I'll try to squeeze this all in. The other question that was highlighted, was there any difference in results due to the jurisdictional ownership or operation of the corridor or the construction of the project? And I would say only in that it relates to sort of the functional class or the type of street. So Laughlin Boulevard is a state highway, so that the jurisdiction is Oregon Department of Transportation. And so I wouldn't say that they did their projects differently than like the city of Milwaukie would have done it. But it's more the fact that it was a major arterial. And so otherwise, I did not detect any differences in sort of how the cities approach the projects. And then there's a question about that I think is a really good thing to be asking about sort of food security and healthy food. That is not something we were able to look at all. We know food establishments. We don't know anything about sort of what food is sold in those. And so we were not able to address that directly. And I don't remember if anything like that came out in our qualitative analysis. So I think I squeezed them all in.
You did, excellent. So, so with that, virtual applause for the presenters. Thank you for taking the time to share your work with us. For those on the seminar, you'll get an email. Please provide your feedback to that. And with that, we will see you next week. Bye-bye.